The U.S. just hit $31 trillion national debt, almost all of it in the form of U.S. Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly U.S. Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? One way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. At the beginning of the Trump administration, it was 106%. So Trump and Biden together have taken up 25 percentage points from 106 to 131. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%.
Here's something you would never hear from any U.S. official. The U.S. is about to collapse, and not only the U.S. but the world's most powerful economies. But why is that going to happen? Well, the answer is simple. It's because the U.S. debt has outweighed its GDP and is 1.3 times more than its GDP. Don't forget that the U.S. is the world's largest economy at $23.387 trillion, and its debt is more than that. Not only that, but the supply chain crisis is again raising its head, and that's the reason why major companies from European countries are exiting and heading to China. What's changing the economic and political order, and what will it mean for you? How will the U.S. economy, earlier considered a stalwart, suffer this time? James Rickards, an economist, best-selling author, and member of the advisory board of the Physical Gold Fund, has insights to share with you. He points towards some obvious weakening links in the system to which no one is paying attention. Let's listen to him and why he thinks the U.S. and the world will soon face a major collapse. Let's get started. Imagine you make $500,000 every month, while your withstanding debt is only $30,000. Would you worry about that? Well, chances are that you won't worry much because you are making more than your debt. However, if you only make $50,000 per year while your debt is $70,000, this certainly is a problem. If you can't pay your debt, your property will be confiscated, or perhaps you will have to announce yourself as bankrupt. Now, this seems to be the case with the U.S. James Rickards tries to explain the trap the U.S. is in the simplest words possible. He is famous for his breathtaking logic and ability to explain complex problems simply. He says that the U.S. has surpassed the point where its earnings were equal to the debt it had on it. In other words, just a few years back, when Donald Trump entered office, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio percentage was 103%. This means that by that time, the debt in the U.S. was 103% of its GDP. However, after Donald Trump up until now, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio percentage has crossed 131%. In other words, the U.S. debt is 131% of its GDP. Simply put, to pay back the debts, the U.S. has to give its one-year GDP as well as 31% of the next year's GDP as well. Is it possible? What if all the U.S. creditors ask the U.S. to pay back all the debts? Well, if this happens, the U.S. has to declare bankruptcy. That's how easy it is for the U.S. to go bankrupt. However, the U.S. trusts that its creditors won't do it. But what if they do it? China is already strengthening its position and has plans to just throw away the U.S. petrodollar economy within the next few years. But the U.S. has no plans. One of the reasons why every U.S. government takes more loans is the USD is the international currency. Since the U.S. gets a loan in the form of USD, it feels the advantage to pay back the debts whenever it wants by printing more USD. However, other countries like Argentina, Greece, and China cannot do so. They have to accumulate capital in their own currency and convert it into USD to repay the loan. But the U.S. doesn't feel that this is a sugar-coated evil. It encourages the U.S. to go into more debt and thus be nearer to bankruptcy every day. Listen to what James Rickards said about that.
When I talk about debt, in particular with the United States, but you can apply this to any country, I focus on the debt to GDP ratio because you can't really talk about debt in isolation without thinking about the capacity to pay the debt. In a simple example, if you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card and you're making $30,000 a year and trying to pay rent in New York, etc., good luck. You're probably going to go bankrupt or at least default on that card. But if you owe $50,000 on your credit card, but you're making $5 million a year, it's, you just write a check. It's no big deal. My point is, you can't look at $50,000 debt and decide if it's a problem or not unless you compare it to the income. And if it's too low, it's a problem. And if the income's high, not a problem. So that's why you use the debt to GDP ratio. The U.S. just hit $31 trillion national debt, almost all of it in the form of U.S. Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly U.S. Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? one way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. At the beginning of the Trump administration, it was 106%. So Trump and Biden together have taken up 25 percentage points from 106 to 131. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt who's making millions. No big deal. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. What's the critical threshold where, water turns to steam or water turns to ice or something changes in such a way that it's not the same? It's radically different, but it happens very quickly. The best research says the answer is 90%. When your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, your multiplier of an additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely. That's a big condition, but you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. That $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, you borrow $1 and you spend $1 and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%. Highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, where you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, debt crises of that magnitude, by the way, if you ask a separate question, say, well, who else is at that lunch table? Who else has a debt to GDP ratio of about 130% or higher? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, Italy. Those are your mates at the lunch table. That's where the United States is. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York. She says it doesn't matter. They always point to Japan. Japan is at 280%, way past any member of the peer group. China's probably higher. China's a little more opaque because they are, but also they don't have as much national debt. If you look at the national debt to GDP, it's modest, but they have an enormous amount of provincial debt, and the banking system is owned by the government or controlled by the government. When you throw in the bank debt, the state-owned enterprises, the provincial debt, and the government, so that's the real national debt. I was in south of Nanjing. They had these ghost cities. I went out to see them. They're real in the sense that, it's steel and glass and copper and cement and asphalt, and they got country clubs and hotels and luxury apartment buildings, etc. And then you look down the horizon, not too far, maybe 7-8 miles, there's another one. And then in the distance, there's another one. They're all empty. They're all empty. But you can create 20,000 jobs for 2 years if you do something like that, or 3 years or longer, but all that money's wasted. Well, that's kind of, tells you a lot about China. But the point being, it was all debt financed and a lot else besides. Stephanie Kelton says it doesn't matter because you're borrowing in your own currency. So if you're Argentine and you borrow in dollars and you print pesos, how are you going to pay the dollars back unless you have, huge trade surpluses, which they don't. So they just default. Argentina is a serial defaulter and everyone expects that. If you borrow in dollars and you print dollars, which the United States does, they're like, what's the problem? Just print the dollars and pay the money back. Well, that's true. If you print dollars, there's no reason to default on dollar debt because you actually can print the money and buy the bonds. But it doesn't mean nothing else bad happens. What about inflation or hyperinflation? What about a foreign exchange rate? The exchange rate can collapse. And these modern monetary theorists show very little understanding of the international aspects. They treat the US like a closed economy, which it's not. If it were a closed economy and we didn't have to worry about trade deficits, trade surpluses, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, China owning $1 trillion of US Treasury securities, which they do. If you didn't have to worry about any of that, I think they'd probably still be wrong, but they'd have a better case. But you do. She says, well, we don't really need a bond market, a US bond market. We only have a bond market as a favor to investors because it gives them a place to put their money. They say when inflation happens, raise taxes. By the way, they also say you don't need a tax system because if you can just print the money, why do you have to collect taxes? And their answer is, we collect taxes to redistribute income. Okay, well, at least they're honest. I mean, that's kind of a socialist model, but they're honest about it. If you ask the typical member of Congress to define modern monetary theory, they'll look at you funny. They've either never heard of it or they certainly don't know what it means, MMT, acting in accordance with modern monetary theory, whether they know it or not.
But that's not the end. Another brewing problem that can hit the entire world quite badly is the supply chain crisis. Here's a little reminder to like the video if you are loving it. And if you don't want to miss videos about the evolving economics and the financial order, subscribe to our channel. Let's continue now. When every country wanted to produce products at the least possible prices, they negotiated to build a global system that we called globalization. It was so phenomenal that the production cost was cut exceptionally, like never before. However, a very key element was left unnoticed: the supply chain. Producers were happy to find a system where they could get the cheapest materials and labor. However, they didn't know they were increasing their dependence. The lesser the things needed to produce, the more independent you are. However, when your product is produced using 1,000 different elements, of which each element, in turn, relies on 1,000 other elements, the production becomes vulnerable. The supply chain is what fulfills the demands. Car factories would need a steady supply of all the raw materials from every country on the planet. That's what globalization has taught us, to get the best things from wherever you want at the best prices. So the car factory relies on metal from one country, plastic from another, leather from another, wheels from another, and so on. In turn, metal, plastic, leather, and wheels would be produced using services from other countries. This creates a chain which we call the supply chain. Now imagine what if one of these thousands of components doesn't reach the factory. Perhaps the shipping took time or the truckers were on strike. There could be thousands of other reasons as well. When this happens, the whole production process stops. That's how vulnerable this system is. When running, it's the most efficient one in the world, but when it ceases, it's the worst. You should know that every product in your home has been built using this system. In other words, everything is just a minor second away from being extinct, from cars to the food on your table. You don't know when you will be able to buy food or the things you need to survive. You should know that now the supply chain has started to collapse, and you should care about that because it's going to bring everyone to their knees. Especially in the US, that will hurt people because the US and China have started to go far from each other. However, the US imports the majority of products from China. Not only did it get finished products, but also raw materials from the whole world, which now is a precarious situation, and the US has to think about it. However, the US simply cannot have the raw materials that aren't found or produced in the US, and that's where the supply chain will have its revenge on the US. Listen to what James Rickards said about that.
Examples, but the point is, in the name of efficiency and lowering costs, we've created enormous fragility, and now it's all breaking down, and it's going to be a big job, 5 to 10 year job to put it back together. And then it kind of feeds on itself. And so what happens when systems like this broke down? So, for example, I like a particular brand of salsa, I like hot sauce. This is a real story. This happened. I go to the supermarket and there's none on the shelf. They don't have it. I go back the second time, they don't have it. I go back the third time, they got it in a case. There's like a whole case. But I usually buy 2 jars. Well, now I buy 10 jars because I'm like, well, I don't know what's going to happen the next time. Maybe they won't have it. And that's called safety stock. You buy some extra inventory. So I pay for that out of my pocket, but it's on the shelf behind me here. But the point is, I'm financing safety stock in my own house because I can't rely on the store to have it in the back room. Well, what does that do to the next person who wants hot sauce? They don't get anything because I took it all. And same thing happens to me and some other product, and everyone's doing the same thing. So you can call it hoarding, you can criticize it. It is inefficient and it costs money, but that's how people react to real supply chain shortages, which of course only makes it worse because now, who knows when the next shipment of hot sauce is coming in. I talked to the guy who probably the single most responsible individual for the creation of the modern supply chain. He said, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build this. It took 3 years to blow it up. It's not coming back overnight. It's going to take 5 or 10 years or longer to create the new supply chain. So what I describe is what I call a college of nations. We're still going to have a supply chain. We always will, but it'll be like a club. And to get in this club, you're going to have to be a democratic, liberal society. I don't mean the politics. I just mean those in the political science sense or the political philosophy sense. But it would be, for example, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Western Europe, UK, probably India, and other countries around the world, probably Brazil. But there'll be countries with shared value, good rule of law, good concern for humanitarian issues, etc., who will trade with each other. but it won't include China. Russia will be, maybe they're in the penalty box, but China will definitely not be in it. China will have to construct its own club, whatever you want to call it, that would include, resource suppliers in Africa and maybe outsourcing in South Asia. And there'll be some people who kind of play both sides, and that's fine. But people say the US is decoupling from China, which is true, but China is decoupling from the US. This is a second nasty divorce, but both sides want out. So what does that mean? It means that relative to some base, costs will be higher because Chinese have a lot they do is repugnant, but they are the manufacturing hub of the world. That's true. It'll be more expensive to do it without them, but it'll be worth it. And the way I look at it.
What do you think? Will the countries, especially the US, survive through the debt trap? Or do you think the US will be near the point of making a compromise with China, who will offer it more funds? China already has offered loans to the US. Perhaps it has to offer more to help the feeble US. Do you think you should start stockpiling food items due to supply chain issues? Comment your opinions in the comment section right below. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel for more videos on the latest economics and financial news. Until the next video, stay tuned.